Welcome back. Tonight, we explore the dark history of Sauron. Relax and let the story gently unfold. In the beginning, before the world took shape, before mountains rose or seas crashed upon shores, there existed only the timeless void and the mind of Eru Ilúvatar, the one who created all things. In that primordial time, Eru brought forth spirits of great power, beings of pure thought and will. These were the Ainur, immortal and mighty, each gifted with unique talents and purposes. Among the lesser Ainur, called the Maia, there emerged one of exceptional brilliance. His name was Mairon, which meant the admirable in the ancient tongue of Quenya. From the very beginning of his existence, Mairon possessed a rare gift. He loved order and perfection, despising waste and chaos. In all things, he sought harmony and efficiency, the precise arrangement of elements in their proper place. Mairon entered the service of Orla the Smith, one of the greatest Valar who shaped the very substance of the world. Under Orla's tutelage, Mairon learned the deepest secrets of smithcraft and making. He mastered the working of stone and metal, understanding how to shape the physical world according to thought and will. Among all of Orla's people, Mairon stood foremost in skill and knowledge. His works were marvels of craftsmanship, admired by all who beheld them. Yet within Mairon's heart, alongside his love of order, there grew a desire that would prove his undoing. He wished not merely to create beautiful things, but to coordinate all existence according to his vision. He longed for the power to arrange the world perfectly, with everything in its proper place, subject to his design. The first corruption. In those days before the world was fully formed, another Valar walked among the Ainur with darkness in his heart. This was Melkor, mightiest of all the Valar, who had descended into pride and rebellion. Melkor sought to dominate all of creation, to bend it to his own purposes rather than follow the designs of Eru Ilúvatar. As Mairon observed Melkor, he saw something that captivated his ambitious spirit. Where the other Valar moved slowly through consensus and debate, changing their plans and strategies repeatedly, Melkor showed focus and consistency. He possessed the will and power to effect his designs quickly and masterfully. To Mairon's eyes, clouded by his desire for order and control, this appeared as strength and efficiency rather than tyranny and destruction. The corruption came gradually, like a slow poison seeping into clear water. Mairon did not wake one morning transformed into evil. Rather, step by step, he justified his alliance with Melkor as a means to achieve his noble goals of order and coordination. He convinced himself that through Melkor's power, he could organize the world more perfectly than the other Valar with their endless deliberations. And so Mairon betrayed the Valar. He became a spy for Melkor upon the blessed Isle of Almaren, where the Valar had made their dwelling. Through his treachery, Melkor destroyed their home, and the Valar fled across the sea to establish new dwellings in the land of Valinor. They did not perceive Sauron's betrayal, and he followed Melkor into Middle-earth, committing himself fully to his new master's service. From that moment forward, Mairon the Admirable ceased to exist. In his place stood Sauron, whose name meant the Abhorred. Among the elves of Beleriand who would later suffer under his hand, he became known as Gorthor, which meant the dread, or the cruel, in their tongue. The transformation was complete, Lieutenant of Darkness. As the First Age dawned, and the elves awakened in Middle-earth, Sauron had become Melkor's most trusted lieutenant. Melkor, now called Morgoth by those who opposed him, established mighty fortresses in the north. First came Utumno, a vast underground citadel of terrible power, and then Angband, a fortress that would become the centre of evil in Middle-earth. Sauron was appointed commander of Angband, overseeing its construction and preparing it for his master's return. When the Valar made war upon Morgoth in ancient days, capturing him and destroying Utumno, they failed to find Sauron. He remained hidden, working tirelessly to maintain Angband and breed armies of orcs in the darkness. His initiative and capability went far beyond mere obedience. He planned and prepared, ensuring that when his master returned, all would be ready. It was Sauron who first discovered the newly awakened elves in their eastern dwellings. What he learned of them, and did in those early encounters, remains shrouded in shadow. But it sowed the first seeds of fear and mistrust that would divide the elder children of Ilúvatar. After Morgoth's return to Middle-earth and the theft of the Silmarils, the Wars of Beleriand began. Throughout these terrible conflicts, Sauron served as Morgoth's chief agent and most effective commander. When Morgoth himself went forth to corrupt the newly awakened race of men, Sauron directed the war against the elves with terrible efficiency. His greatest achievement came when he conquered the elvish island fortress of Tol Sirion. He renamed it Tol in Garoth, the Isle of Werewolves, and established himself as its Dark Lord. There he commanded both werewolves and vampires, using them as weapons against the free peoples. From this stronghold, he orchestrated the death of Barahir, a great warrior among men, and later imprisoned the elven king Finrod Felagund. Sauron demonstrated powers both subtle and terrible. He could take many forms, appearing as a great wolf, a serpent, or a vampire. His sorcery was formidable, making him master of shadows and phantoms. He twisted what he touched and ruled through torment. His very presence inspired dread in the hearts of his enemies. Yet even Sauron's power had limits. When the maiden Luthien came to his fortress to rescue her beloved Beren, she brought with her Huan, the great wolfhound of Valinor. In the battle that followed, Sauron took the form of the greatest werewolf that had ever lived and fought with all his might. But Huan seized him by the throat, and Sauron was defeated. He fled in the shape of a massive vampire bat, and Luthien destroyed his tower, freeing all his prisoners. Through all the years of the First Age, Sauron served Morgoth faithfully, helping coordinate the vast armies and strategic operations of the Dark Power. But at last, the patience of the Valar ended. In response to the plea of Eärendil the Mariner, the Valar themselves came to war against Morgoth in the conflict called the War of Wrath. The war lasted more than 40 years. Armies beyond counting clashed across Beleriand. Great eagles fought with dragons in the sky while below. The host of Valinor battled against Morgoth's legions. In the end, Morgoth was defeated, captured, and cast through the doors of night into the void beyond the world. The war was so devastating that all of Beleriand sank beneath the waves, leaving only the western edges that would later be called Lindon. But once again, Sauron escaped. He did not perish with his master's downfall. The Hidden Years. When the War of Wrath ended, Ernwë, the Herald of Manwë, commanded all of Morgoth's servants to come forth and submit to judgment. Some did, seeking pardon and redemption. Sauron, proud and afraid, could not bring himself to face the Valar's justice. He feared their wrath and punishment, and perhaps also he could not bear to acknowledge the full extent of his crimes. Instead, Sauron remained in Middle-earth, hiding in the ruined wastelands. His spirit endured, waiting in shadows and desolate places. For the first 500 years of the Second Age, he lay low, nursing his ambitions in secret while slowly rebuilding his strength. The world had changed. Morgoth was gone, cast out forever. The elves who remained in Middle-earth were wiser and warier. Men had been given the island of Númenor as a reward for their aid in the war, and there they were, building a great civilization. The dwarves dwelt in their mountain halls. All the free peoples hoped for an age of peace and healing. But Sauron had learned much from his long service to Morgoth. He understood the ways of domination and deceit. Most importantly, he had concluded that Morgoth's methods had been too crude, too overtly destructive. Morgoth had sought to unmake creation itself. Sauron, ever the craftsman and orderer, conceived of a different path to power. He would not seek to destroy the world. He would seek to rule it, to organize it according to his vision of perfect order. And to achieve this, he needed tools of power that could extend his will across all of Middle-earth. Around the year 500 of the Second Age, Sauron began to stir once more. He returned to Middle-earth openly, choosing the land of Mordor as his dwelling place. It was a strategic choice. Surrounded by mountains, defensible from attack, and containing the volcano Orodruin called Mount Doom, it offered both protection and a source of great power. Mount Doom was no ordinary volcano. It had been created by Morgoth in ages past, and its fires were connected to the deep powers of the earth. Sauron understood that he could use these primordial flames in his sorceries and his forging. The mountain would become central to his greatest work, the Deceiver's art. But before Sauron could forge his instruments of power, he needed knowledge that he himself did not fully possess. The elves of Eregion, led by the master smith Celebrimbor, had achieved great skill in crafting. Celebrimbor was the grandson of Fëanor himself, the greatest craftsman who had ever lived among the elves. If Sauron could learn from Celebrimbor, or better yet, deceive him into helping the power of the artifacts he could create would be magnified tremendously. So Sauron once again cloaked himself in a fair form. He appeared to the elves not as a servant of darkness, but as a being of light and wisdom. He named himself Anatar, which meant Lord of Gifts, and claimed to be an emissary from the Valar themselves, sent to share knowledge and help the peoples of Middle-earth achieve greatness. He first approached Gil-galad, the High King of the Elves in Lindon, and Elrond, the wise half-elven lord. But they mistrusted him, perceiving something amiss in his too smooth words and too perfect appearance. They would not receive him. Undeterred, Sauron travelled to Eregion, where Celebrimbor ruled over a fellowship of elven smiths called the Gwaith I Myrdain. These craftsmen were devoted to their art, and they had established strong friendships with the dwarves of Khazad-dûm, the great mansions beneath the misty mountains. Together, elves and dwarves created works of surpassing beauty and power. When Anatar arrived in Eregion with his gifts and his honeyed words, Celebrimbor was initially cautious, but the temptation was too great. Here was knowledge that could elevate their craft to heights never before achieved. Here was the opportunity to create something that might rival even the works of Feanor. Celebrimbor's pride and ambition overcame his caution, and he welcomed Anatar into his forges. For years, they worked together. Anatar taught the smiths of Eregion how to craft rings of power, magical artifacts that could enhance the natural abilities of their bearers and preserve what was precious from the decay of time. The concept seemed noble, rings that could help the elves slow the fading of their realms in Middle-earth, making them more like the blessed land of Valinor, from which their ancestors had come. 16 rings were forged with Sauron's guidance. 7 were intended for the lords of the dwarves, and 9 for great men. But Celebrimbor also worked in secret, without Sauron's knowledge, to forge 3 additional rings. These were the greatest of all: Narya, the ring of fire; Nenya, the ring of water; and Vilya, the ring of air. These 3 Celebrimbor made alone, using the knowledge he had gained, but not allowing Sauron's direct touch to corrupt them. Yet Celebrimbor did not realize that all the rings shared a fatal flaw. The craft that Sauron had taught incorporated a binding magic into the very essence of the rings. They were connected, linked by the methods of their creation, even those that Celebrimbor made in secret. The One Ring. Around the year 1600 of the Second Age, Sauron returned to Mordor. He ascended the slopes of Mount Doom and entered the Samath Nar, the Chambers of Fire, within the heart of the volcano. There, in absolute secrecy, he began his greatest and most terrible work. The ring that Sauron intended to forge needed to be more powerful than all the others combined. It needed to dominate them, to control their bearers, to serve as a master ring that could bring all the others under his sway. Such power required a tremendous sacrifice. Sauron understood what he must do. To give the One Ring the strength it needed, he would have to imbue it with a great portion of his own essence, his own fire or soul. He would pour into it his cruelty, his malice, and his will to dominate all life. The ring would become an extension of himself, containing his power in physical form. In the fires of Mount Doom, Sauron forged the One Ring. It appeared as a simple band of gold, unadorned by any gem, seemingly plain and innocent. But when heated, it revealed its true nature. Fiery letters appeared on its surface, written in the black speech that Sauron had devised, using the elvish script of Tengwar. The inscription read, "One ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them." This was not merely an inscription. These words were part of the spell that gave the ring its power, a declaration of its purpose that bound all the other rings of power to it. When Sauron placed the completed One Ring upon his finger, its power surged through him. Immediately, he reached out through the connection to all the other rings. In that moment, the elves who wore their rings felt his presence, clear and undeniable. They heard him speak the words of the ring's inscription, and they knew they had been betrayed. The elves tore off their rings in horror. Celebrimbor finally understood the full extent of Sauron's deception. The Lord of Gifts was no emissary of the Valar, but the ancient enemy himself, and all their work had been turned toward evil purposes. The 3 rings that Celebrimbor had made in secret were still untouched by Sauron's direct corruption, but even they were bound to the One Ring's power. Sauron's plan to control the elves through the rings had failed at its very inception, but he still possessed the greatest artifact of power ever created in Middle-earth. And he had the other rings. His path to domination would simply require more force than cunning. The dark years begin. Sauron's wrath was terrible. He declared war upon the elves, determined to seize the rings by force if he could not control them through subtle means. His armies, long prepared in secret, poured forth from Mordor. Orcs and other foul creatures multiplied under his command, and he gathered to himself all the evil servants of Morgoth that still remained in Middle-earth. In the year 1697 of the Second Age, Sauron invaded Eriador. His forces were overwhelming. They surrounded and destroyed Eregion, and Celebrimbor was captured. Sauron tortured the elven smith cruelly, seeking to learn the whereabouts of all the rings. Under torment, Celebrimbor revealed where the 7 rings for the dwarves had been sent, but he refused, even unto death, to reveal what had become of the 3 rings of the elves. Sauron killed Celebrimbor and seized the 9 rings intended for men, along with most of the 7 rings for dwarves. His armies pushed the elves back toward the Blue Mountains, and it seemed that all of Eriador would fall under his shadow. But help came from an unexpected quarter. The Númenóreans, the great men who dwelt on their island kingdom far to the west, sent a massive fleet to Middle-earth. Their armies were mighty beyond anything Sauron had anticipated, and when they joined with the remaining elves under Gil-galad, Sauron's forces were utterly defeated. He was driven back to Mordor, his ambitions temporarily checked. Yet Sauron still held the One Ring, and his power remained formidable. He fortified Mordor, completing the construction of his great tower of Barad-dûr, the Dark Tower. Its foundations were laid with the power of the ring, making it virtually indestructible so long as the ring endured. From this fortress, Sauron began to distribute the rings he had captured. The 7 rings went to the dwarf lords. Sauron hoped to use them to control the dwarves, as he had intended to control the elves. But the dwarves proved more resistant than he expected. Their natural hardiness and stubbornness protected them from domination. The rings only increased their greed for gold and treasure, making them more isolated and paranoid, but not enslaving them to Sauron's will. The 9 rings, however, achieved exactly what Sauron desired. He gave them to great lords among men, and at first these men seemed to gain much. The rings granted them power, long life, and the ability to accomplish great deeds. But slowly, inevitably, the rings corrupted them. Year by year, the power consumed them, until at last they faded from the world of the living, becoming wraiths the Nazgûl, the ring wraiths, forever enslaved to Sauron's will. They became his most feared servants, cloaked and hooded, riding forth on their terrible missions, with their lord's malice burning within them. For many years, Sauron's dominion spread across the east and south of Middle-earth. He ruled through force and fear, naming himself Lord of the Earth and King of Men. He wore a fair form when it suited him, deceiving those who could be deceived, and showed his true terrible nature to those he wished to frighten. The years from roughly 1,700 to 3,262 of the Second Age became known as the Dark Years, when much of Middle-earth suffered under his shadow. The pride of Númenor. As the centuries passed, Númenor grew ever mightier. Their ships sailed all the seas, and they established colonies and havens on the coasts of Middle-earth. But pride grew in their hearts as well. The Númenóreans began to resent the decree of the Valar that forbade them from sailing west to the Undying Lands. They saw the immortality of the elves and grew bitter about their own mortality. When Sauron began attacking Númenórean settlements and taking the title King of Men for himself, the Númenóreans were enraged. How dare this upstart claim dominion over men when Númenor held such power? In the year 3,262 of the Second Age, Ar-Pharazôn, last and most powerful king of Númenor, assembled the greatest army that had ever been gathered and sailed to Middle-earth. When Sauron saw the might and splendor of the Númenórean host, when he beheld the glory of Ar-Pharazôn and the countless thousands who marched under his banner, even the Dark Lord was dismayed. His own servants deserted him in fear. Sauron realized he could not defeat such an army through force of arms, so he surrendered. He humbled himself before Ar-Pharazôn, begging for mercy and offering to submit to Númenor's authority. It was a cunning move, both voluntary and calculated. Ar-Pharazôn, proud of his bloodless victory, took Sauron as a prisoner back to Númenor. This was exactly what Sauron wanted. He had learned that brute force alone could not achieve his goals. But corruption, deception, and the turning of his enemies' strength against themselves, these were arts in which he excelled. On Númenor, Sauron rose swiftly from prisoner to advisor. His fair appearance, his wisdom about many things, and his silver tongue won him the trust of the king. Ar-Pharazôn, already prideful and fearful of death, proved all too susceptible to Sauron's manipulations. Sauron taught that the Valar had deceived them. He spoke of Melkor, calling him by his ancient name and portraying him as the true creator, the Lord of Darkness, who alone could grant freedom and power. He claimed that the ban against sailing to Valinor was not mercy but jealousy, that the Valar sought to keep immortality for themselves and their elvish favourites. Gradually, the king fell under Sauron's influence. The worship of Morgoth was established, first in secret and then openly. A great temple was built, and within it, Sauron became high priest. The faithful, those Númenóreans who still revered Eru Ilúvatar and the Valar, were persecuted. The White Tree, symbol of their connection to the Valar, was cut down. Human sacrifices were offered to Morgoth in the temple's dark fires. But Sauron's greatest deception was yet to come. As Ar-Pharazôn grew old, despite all Sauron's promises, the Dark Lord whispered a final terrible counsel. The only way to achieve immortality, he said, was to take it by force. They must sail to Valinor itself, conquer the Valar, and seize the Undying Lands. Ar-Pharazôn, in his pride and fear of death, listened. He assembled a fleet so vast that it covered the sea. The armada sailed west, breaking the ban that had stood since Númenor's founding. Sauron remained behind, watching and waiting, believing his revenge on the Númenóreans was complete. But he had miscalculated. His corruption of Númenor was so thorough, his manipulation so profound, that it drew the attention of Eru Ilúvatar himself. When the fleets of Númenor landed on the shores of Valinor and Ar-Pharazôn set foot on the Undying Lands, the one intervened directly. Eru opened a great chasm in the sea. The earth shook, and mighty waves rose up. Númenor was swallowed by the ocean, sinking beneath the waves, along with all who dwelt there, save for the small number of the faithful, who had fled in 9 ships, led by Elendil. The world itself was changed. It had been flat, and the Undying Lands had been accessible by ship. But Eru made the world round, removing Valinor from the physical realm, so that no mortal could reach it again by any ship. Sauron's body was destroyed in the cataclysm. As Númenor fell into the abyss, his fair form perished with it. But his spirit endured, bound to the one ring that he had left in Middle-earth. He fled back to Mordor, taking up the ring once more. Yet the loss of his body had cost him greatly. Never again would Sauron be able to assume a fair form. From that day forward, his shape would be terrible and dark, an image of malice and hatred made visible. His power was diminished, though still formidable, and he had gained new enemies. For Elendil and his sons Isildur and Anarion had survived the downfall and were establishing new kingdoms in Middle-earth, Arnor in the north and Gondor in the south. The last alliance, Sauron did not wait long to strike at the new kingdoms. As soon as he had rebuilt enough strength to take physical form again, he attacked Gondor. But he had underestimated the resolve of his enemies and acted before his power was fully restored. Gil-galad, High King of the Elves, had used the years wisely to strengthen his forces. When Sauron attacked Gondor, Elendil sent word to Gil-galad, and together they formed the last alliance of elves and men. It was a union of all the free peoples who opposed the Dark Lord, and their combined might was tremendous. In the year 3434 of the Second Age, the last alliance marched across Middle-earth to war. They met Sauron's armies on the plain of Dagorlad before the Black Gate of Mordor. The battle was terrible, and losses were heavy on both sides, but the alliance prevailed. Sauron's forces were driven back into Mordor. The alliance laid siege to Barad-dûr. The siege lasted 7 long years. Sauron's fortress was mighty, its foundations unbreakable, and his armies within were vast. Many fell during those years of waiting and fighting. The casualties mounted steadily, but still, the alliance held firm. At last, in the year 3441 of the Second Age, Sauron himself came forth from his tower. He could not break the siege from within, so he led his forces in a desperate attempt to destroy the besiegers. The battle that followed took place on the slopes of Mount Doom itself. Sauron faced the mightiest warriors of the Alliance. Gil-galad and Elendil themselves fought against him, and at their side stood Elendil's sons and the elf lords Elrond and Círdan. The combat was fierce and deadly. Sauron was terrible in his wrath, wielding powers that few could withstand. He struck down Gil-galad, the last High King of the Noldor, ending a line of kingship that stretched back to the Elder Days. He shattered Elendil beneath him, breaking the great sword Narsil. But in doing so, Sauron himself was overthrown. Wounded mortally, he fell. Isildur, seeing his father dead and his sword broken, took up the hilt of Narsil. With the broken blade, he cut the one ring from Sauron's hand, severing the finger that bore it. Bereft of the ring's power, Sauron's physical form could not be sustained. His spirit fled, and his body perished. The hosts of Mordor, leaderless and terrified, were routed. The Alliance hunted down the fleeing orcs and destroyed them. Barad-dûr was cast down, though its foundations remained because they had been built with the power of the ring itself and could not be destroyed while the ring endured. Isildur stood victorious, holding the One Ring. Elrond and Círdan counselled him urgently to destroy it, to cast it into the fires of Mount Doom that were so close at hand. If he did so, Sauron would be destroyed forever, reduced to a mere shadow with no power to harm the world again. But Isildur refused. The ring was beautiful and terrible, and it had already begun its corruption. He claimed it as weregild for his father and brother, compensation for their deaths. Despite the wisdom of Elrond and Círdan, despite knowing what the ring was and what it could do, Isildur kept it. So Sauron, though defeated and cast down, was not destroyed. His spirit remained, bound to the ring that still existed. Isildur would not live long to enjoy his prize. 2 years later, he was ambushed by orcs at the Gladden Fields. He put on the ring to escape, but it betrayed him, slipping from his finger as he swam across the river. Suddenly visible, he was killed by orc arrows. The ring sank into the depths of the River Anduin and was lost. The Second Age had ended. The Third Age began. And somewhere in the darkness, Sauron's spirit waited, patient and malevolent, knowing that while the ring existed, he could not be truly destroyed. The shadow returns. For 1,000 years of the Third Age, Sauron lay hidden, a mere shadow of malice lurking in dark and desolate places. He had no power to take physical form, no strength to command armies. He was patient, waiting for the slow passage of time to restore enough of his essence that he might act again. Around the year 1000 of the Third Age, Sauron had gathered enough power to begin acting in the world. He was drawn to the forest that had once been called Greenwood the Great. In its southern reaches stood a hill called Amon Lanc, which had once been the capital of the woodland elves. Sauron claimed this hill and built upon it a fortress that came to be known as Dol Guldur, the Hill of Sorcery. Sauron did not reveal himself openly. Instead, he took the guise of the Necromancer, a dread sorcerer whose true identity remained hidden. From Dol Guldur, his shadow spread across the forest. Trees withered and became corrupt. Foul things bred in the depths. The woodland elves fled north, and Greenwood became Mirkwood, a place of terror and darkness. The Valar, perceiving that evil was stirring again in Middle-earth, sent 5 Maia to oppose it. These took the form of old men and became known as the Istari, or wizards. Among them were Saruman the White, Gandalf the Grey, and Radagast the Brown. Their mission was to guide and counsel the free peoples, not to dominate them with power. Around this time, the Nazgûl also reappeared. They had been lying dormant, waiting for their master's return. Now they stirred again, and one among them, the Witch King of Angmar, established a realm in the north from which he waged war on the Dúnedain kingdoms. Over many years, through conquest and plague and division, the northern kingdom of Arnor was destroyed. Gandalf, always the most active and far-seeing of the wizards, became suspicious of the necromancer. The concentration of evil in Dol Guldur, the spread of shadow across Mirkwood, the resurgence of orcs and other foul creatures, all of these suggested something more than a mere sorcerer at work. In the year 2063, Gandalf entered Dol Guldur to investigate. Sauron, not yet ready to be discovered, fled to the east. There followed a period of about 400 years called the Watchful Peace. Evil remained in the world, but the power of Dol Guldur seemed to have departed. But Sauron was merely gathering his strength. He made alliances with the men of the east, adding to his forces. He plotted and planned, searching always for any hint of where his ring might be found. Around the year 2460, he returned to Dol Guldur with renewed vigor. Now his plans moved forward on multiple fronts. He sent orcs to trouble the dwarves in their mountain halls. He encouraged the great dragons of the north in their attacks on dwarf and men alike. In 2845, he captured Thrain, king of Durin's folk, and imprisoned him in the dungeons of Dol Guldur, taking from him the last of the Seven Rings. 5 years later, Gandalf returned to Dol Guldur. This time he discovered Thrain dying in the dungeons, though the dwarf lord no longer remembered even his own name. Before he died, Thrain gave Gandalf a map and a key. After this encounter, Gandalf was certain the necromancer was indeed Sauron returned. Gandalf urged the White Council, a gathering of the wise that included himself, Saruman, Elrond, Galadriel, and Círdan, to attack Dol Guldur before Sauron's power grew further. But Saruman, who led the council, counselled against it. Unknown to the others, Saruman had his own plans. He had been searching for the One Ring, hoping to find it for himself, and he thought that leaving Sauron in Dol Guldur might eventually lead to the ring's discovery. But Saruman's hand was eventually forced. The threat of Sauron's growing power became too obvious to ignore, especially with Smaug the dragon occupying Erebor and threatening to ally with the Dark Lord. In 2941, the council finally attacked Dol Guldur. Sauron, still not at full strength, could not withstand the combined might of the White Council. He fled from Dol Guldur, abandoning his fortress. But this was not a true defeat. He had been preparing for this moment. Everything was ready in Mordor. The Nazgul had rebuilt Barad-dûr. His armies were assembled. His alliances with evil men were firmly established. In the year 2951, just 10 years after fleeing Dol Guldur, Sauron returned openly to Mordor. He sent 3 of the Nazgul to retake Dol Guldur so it could serve as an outpost. But his true seat of power was once again the Dark Tower. Sauron declared himself openly, no longer hiding behind the guise of the necromancer. The reconstruction of Barad-dûr was completed. Mount Doom erupted and burned continuously, its fires serving his purposes. From his tower, he could see all the lands around him, and few things escaped his notice. The Eye of Sauron became the symbol of his power, an eye of fire that watched ceaselessly, seeking always for the ring. For Sauron had learned something crucial. His spies and servants had discovered that the One Ring had been found. A creature called Gollum had possessed it for centuries, but it had abandoned him. The ring had been picked up by a hobbit, one of the small folk of the Shire. Sauron did not know which hobbit or where precisely the ring was, but he knew it had returned to the world. He captured Gollum and tortured him, learning the words Shire and Baggins. With this knowledge, Sauron sent the Nazgul forth to find the ring and bring it back to him. If he could reclaim his greatest creation, no power in Middle-earth could stand against him, the Great Mustering. As the Nazgul began their hunt in the year 3018, Sauron continued his other preparations. He was not depending solely on recovering the ring. Even without it, his power was vast, and his strategy was comprehensive. In Mordor itself, Sauron commanded legions beyond counting. Orcs bred in great pits, their numbers swelling day by day. He had trolls of various breeds, including the powerful Olog-hai that could endure sunlight. There were wargs, great wolves that served as mounts for orc riders. And there were the Nazgul themselves, riding on fell beasts, terrible flying creatures that struck fear into all who saw them. Beyond Mordor's borders, Sauron had spent centuries building alliances. The men of Harad in the south, the Easterlings from Rhûn, and the Corsairs of Umbar. All of these had been brought under his influence through a combination of promises, threats, and ancient pacts. Their armies were his to command, and they numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Sauron's strategy was methodical and thorough. He attacked on multiple fronts, seeking to divide his enemies and prevent any unified resistance. His forces from Dol Guldur assaulted the woodland realm of Thranduil and the Lothlorien of Celeborn and Galadriel. His Easterling allies attacked the dwarves of Erebor and the men of Dale. Armies from Mordor moved against Gondor, striking at Minas Tirith and other fortifications. In this great chess game, Sauron was the Grandmaster, moving pieces across the board of Middle-earth with practiced skill. His attention to detail was remarkable. Nothing was left to chance. Supply lines were established, sieges were planned, and contingencies were prepared. But there was one factor that Sauron's strategic brilliance could not fully account for: the possibility that someone would seek to destroy the ring rather than use it. It was a blind spot in his thinking, born from his own nature. Sauron could not conceive that anyone with the power to wield the ring would choose to unmake it. To him, the desire for power was fundamental and universal. The ring's destruction seemed not just unlikely, but essentially impossible. When the Council of Elrond decided to send the ring to Mount Doom to be destroyed, when a small fellowship set out on this desperate quest, Sauron did not perceive their true purpose. He believed, as any would who thought as he did, that they must be planning to use the ring against him. Perhaps they would give it to one of the powerful, to Gandalf or Galadriel or Aragorn. Perhaps they would try to wield it themselves. Sauron's eye turned toward Gondor, seeking the one who would challenge him with his own weapon. He never imagined that two small hobbits were walking toward Mordor itself, seeking to cast the ring into the fire. The War of the Ring. The great conflict began in earnest in March of 3019. The forces of Mordor attacked Gondor in overwhelming strength, beginning with the siege of Minas Tirith. The armies that Sauron sent forth were immense, tens of thousands of orcs, trolls, and men from the east and south. They were led by the Witch King, chief of the Nazgul, and Sauron's most terrible servant. The siege was brutal. Great engines of war battered the walls. The Witch King wielded dark sorcery to terrify the defenders. A massive ram called Grond, named after Morgoth's ancient weapon, broke through the gates of the city. For a time, it seemed that Minas Tirith would fall, and with it all hope of resistance. But help came from Rohan, the kingdom of horse lords to the north. King Théoden led 6,000 riders to Gondor's aid. In the Battle of the Pelennor Fields that followed, the tide turned. The Witch King was destroyed by Éowyn, a woman of Rohan, and Merry, a hobbit fulfilling an ancient prophecy that he would not fall by the hand of man. Yet even as the battle raged at Minas Tirith, Sauron's attention began to shift. A Palantir, one of the seeing stones of old, was used to challenge him. He saw in the stone a figure that appeared to be a great warrior wielding the Ring of Power. This was Aragorn, heir of Isildur, revealing himself and claiming his heritage. Sauron's thoughts became focused on this threat. If Isildur's heir had the ring, if he was learning to master it, then he represented a danger that must be dealt with immediately. When Aragorn led a much smaller army to the Black Gate of Mordor itself, issuing a challenge to single combat, Sauron believed this was the expected confrontation the new ring-bearer come to claim dominion over Middle-earth. The Dark Lord emptied Mordor of defenders, sending almost every available warrior to the Black Gate. It was a trap, he believed. He would surround and destroy this challenger and all who followed him. He would reclaim the ring and cement his victory in one stroke. But it was Sauron who had been trapped. While he focused his attention and his armies on the Black Gate, while the eye searched ceaselessly for the ring-bearer he expected to find among the warriors before his gate, the real threat crept through the mountains of Mordor itself. Frodo Baggins and Samwise Gamgee, two hobbits from the Shire, had crossed through the spider-haunted pass of Cirith Ungol. They had entered Mordor undetected, disguising themselves as orcs. Step by painful step, they made their way across the desolate plain of Gorgoroth toward Mount Doom. On the 25th of March 3019, as the Battle of the Morannon raged at the Black Gate, Frodo reached the Samath Nor, the chambers of fire within Mount Doom where the ring had been forged. He stood at the very edge of the cracks of Doom, where the fires burned hot enough to unmake the ring. But at that final moment, the ring's power overcame him. Frodo had carried it too far, resisted it too long. He claimed it for himself, placing it on his finger. Immediately, Sauron knew. The deception was revealed. His eye turned away from the Black Gate, focusing instantly on Mount Doom. In that terrible moment, Sauron understood everything. They had not sought to use the ring. They had sought to destroy it. And now, at the last moment when it seemed they had failed, the ring-bearer had claimed it in the very place where it could be unmade. Sauron sent the Nazgul flying toward Mount Doom with desperate speed. If they could reach the Samath Nor in time, if they could stop the hobbits, all could yet be saved. But fate, or Providence, intervened. Gollum, who had followed Frodo and Sam into Mordor, attacked Frodo in the chamber. In the struggle, Gollum bit off Frodo's finger, claiming the ring for himself. Dancing in mad joy at the edge of the precipice, Gollum lost his balance and fell into the fire, the ring still on the finger in his mouth. The one ring fell into the flames of Mount Doom and was unmade. the unmaking. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The ring that Sauron had forged with so much of his own essence, the artifact into which he had poured his power and his very self, ceased to exist. The connection that had sustained him was severed. The foundation upon which his continued existence depended dissolved. Barad-dûr, whose foundations had been laid with the ring's power, could no longer stand. The great tower collapsed, crashing down in ruin. The earth shook, and Mount Doom erupted in a final cataclysm. The very ground of Mordor heaved and broke. The Nazgûl, flying toward Mount Doom at their master's command, were caught in the eruption. As the ring was destroyed, so too were they finally released from their cursed existence. They fell into the flames and were consumed. The armies of Mordor, suddenly leaderless and directionless, lost all cohesion. Orcs turned on each other or fled in panic. The trolls became confused and aimless. The great host that had surrounded the armies at the Black Gate simply fell apart. And Sauron himself, the great architect of so much evil, the schemer who had played the long game across ages of the world, was reduced to nothing. His spirit, lacking the ring that had sustained it, could no longer maintain any form or presence in the world. He became a shadow that dispersed on the wind, powerless and impotent, doomed to never again affect the world he had sought to dominate. In that moment, thousands of years of planning and preparation, millennia of careful strategy and patient accumulation of power, came to nothing. The Dark Lord, who had served Morgoth and then sought to complete his master's work, who had forged the rings of power and corrupted great kingdoms, who had orchestrated wars and manipulated nations, all of this ended in the fires of Mount Doom. The Third Age drew toward its close. The threat of Sauron that had hung over Middle-earth like a shadow was lifted. The sun broke through the clouds above Mordor, shining on lands that had known only darkness for so long. The mark upon the world, yet even in his destruction, Sauron left marks upon the world that would endure. The physical scars were obvious enough. Mordor remained a wasteland, though without Sauron's malice to sustain them, the evil creatures that had dwelt there diminished or fled. The Black Gate stood broken. Minas Morgul, the dreadful city that had been the stronghold of the Witch King, remained haunted and empty, a place of ill omen. But there were other, deeper changes that Sauron's presence had wrought. The elves, who had fought against him through all the long ages, began their final departure from Middle-earth. The bearers of the three rings, Elrond, Galadriel, and Gandalf, sailed into the west. For the time of the elves was ending. The magic of the elder days was fading, and the world was becoming a place for men to shape. The kingdoms of men that survived the war were forever altered. Gondor and Arnor were reunited under King Elessar, the name that Aragorn took when he claimed his throne. But the old glory of Númenor, the greatness that had existed before Sauron's corruption of that realm, could never be fully restored. The world had changed too much. The other rings of power lost their potency with the destruction of the One Ring. The three rings of the elves ceased to function, which was part of why their bearers departed. The 7 rings of the dwarves had mostly been lost or destroyed over the ages, and what remained became mere trinkets. The 9 rings of men disappeared with the Nazgûl who had borne them. The knowledge that Sauron had possessed, both the wisdom he had learned in the depths of time and the terrible lore he had developed in Morgoth's service, was lost. The craft of making such rings of power was ended. The deep sorceries that had sustained creatures like the Nazgûl could no longer be wielded. In a sense, Sauron's defeat marked not just the end of his own evil, but the diminishment of magic itself in Middle-earth. Those who had been directly touched by Sauron's malice carried scars that would never fully heal. Frodo, who had borne the ring to Mount Doom, found that he could not return to the simple life of the Shire. The burden had been too great, the wound too deep. In time, he too sailed into the west, seeking the healing that Middle-earth could not provide. The servants of darkness who survived scattered to the corners of the world. Some orcs fled into the mountains and waste places, becoming scattered tribes without purpose. The men who had served Sauron returned to their lands diminished, their kings overthrown, their power broken. The Haradrim and Easterlings would slowly make peace with Gondor over the years that followed, but the old enmities that Sauron had fostered would take generations to fully heal. Reflections in the darkness. The tale of Sauron is one that begins in light and ends in shadow, a chronicle of corruption and fall that spans the entire history of the world. He began as Mairon the Admirable, a spirit of order and craft who served the smith of the Valar. He ended as a powerless wraith, dispersed and destroyed, remembered only as the Dark Lord whose evil had stained the ages. How does one fall so far? The question has no simple answer, but perhaps it begins with the small compromises. Mairon desired order, and in that desire there was nothing inherently wrong. But he came to value order over freedom, efficiency over mercy, his own vision over the natural growth and chaos of life. When Melkor offered him the power to implement his designs quickly and completely, he convinced himself that the end justified the means. From that first compromise, each subsequent step became easier. Each act of cruelty or deception could be rationalized as necessary for the greater good, the perfect order he sought to impose. By the time he had become Sauron, by the time his hands were stained with the blood of thousands and his soul was given over to domination and control, there was no path back. He had gone too far, become too committed to the course he had chosen. Yet even in his evil, Sauron retained certain qualities from his origins. He remained a craftsman, though now his works were twisted toward dark purposes. The One Ring was, in its own terrible way, a masterpiece, a perfect expression of its creator's will and purpose. His strategies were intricate and well-planned. His administration of his domains showed the same attention to detail and organization that had once characterized his service to Orla. This perhaps makes Sauron's story more tragic than that of his master Morgoth. Morgoth had descended into nihilistic hatred, seeking ultimately to destroy all of creation. But Sauron never abandoned his love of order. He genuinely believed, or had once believed, that he could rule Middle-earth better than it ruled itself, that his vision of perfect coordination and organization would be superior to the free choices of its peoples. The tragedy lies in his inability to see that true order cannot be imposed from without, that any system built on domination and fear will ultimately collapse, that freedom and the chaos that comes with it are essential to life itself. Sauron's perfect order was the order of death, everything in its place, nothing changing, nothing growing, nothing free to choose its own path. In the end, it was the smallest and most overlooked of all the peoples of Middle-earth who brought about his downfall. Hobbits, whom Sauron barely acknowledged as significant, proved to be his undoing. They succeeded where the mighty failed, not through strength or power, but through courage, perseverance, and the ability to resist corruption, qualities that Sauron, for all his ancient wisdom, could not understand or predict. The ring, which Sauron had forged to be the ultimate tool of domination, became instead the instrument of his destruction. He had put so much of himself into it that he could not exist without it, yet its existence made him vulnerable in a way he had never anticipated. The creation that was meant to secure his victory forever became the fatal weakness that ended him. The long sleep of history. In the ages that followed Sauron's defeat, his story became legend, and legend became myth. The details were recorded in books in the Red Book of Westmarch, in the records of Gondor, in the memories of the elves who remained for a time before sailing west. But as the years passed into centuries, and the centuries into millennia, even these records faded. The great Barad-dûr lay in ruins, a testament to the folly of seeking domination. Mordor remained desolate, though life slowly returned to its borders. Mount Doom stood silent, its fires banked, no longer fed by the will of its former master. The One Ring was gone forever, unmade in the fires that had forged it, leaving no trace but the stories of its power and its end. In the peaceful lands of the Shire, hobbits tended their gardens and told stories by the fireside. They spoke of Frodo and Sam, of the great journey to Mordor and back, but even these tales took on the quality of fairy stories, events so distant and fantastical that they seemed to belong to another world entirely. And perhaps that was fitting. Sauron had been a creature of another age, a relic of the ancient wars between the powers of the world. His passing marked the end of an era, the final closing of the chapter that had begun with the music of the Ainur at the world's creation. The evil he represented, the desire to control all things, to impose one's will upon the world regardless of the cost, did not die with him. Such impulses are perhaps woven into the nature of conscious beings. The perpetual temptation to believe that we know better than others how their lives should be lived. But the particular evil that was Sauron, the darkness that he embodied and spread across ages, was ended. The stars wheeled overhead as they had since the beginning of time. The moon waxed and waned. The seasons turned, bringing spring after winter, harvest after growth. In this rhythm, In this natural order that no one controlled or dominated, there was a peace that Sauron had never been able to find or understand. For he had sought to be the master of all things, and in that seeking he had made himself slave to his own ambition. He had forged a ring that controlled others, but found himself controlled by it in turn. He had accumulated power beyond measure, but discovered too late that power without wisdom is merely the capacity for greater ruin. The peoples of Middle-earth rebuilt their lives. Gardens grew where armies had marched. Songs of joy replaced the war cries and the sounds of battle. Children played in the sunshine, knowing nothing of the shadow that had once threatened to cover all the world. And in this simple peace, in this return to the ordinary rhythms of life, there was something that all of Sauron's power had never been able to achieve or destroy. For life continues, adapts, and ultimately outlasts even the mightiest of evils. The strong towers fall, the powerful perish, but the seeds that they tried to crush split stone and grow toward the light. The final lesson: what remains of Sauron now is a story, a cautionary tale told across the generations. It speaks of how the greatest among us can fall if we let pride and the desire for control overcome wisdom and compassion. It reminds us that evil often begins with good intentions, with a desire to make things better according to our own understanding, but transforms into tyranny when we assume we alone know the right path. The tale of the Dark Lord shows us that power corrupts most insidiously, not when it makes us cruel, but when it makes us certain that we know what is best, certain that our vision should be imposed on all, certain that the end justifies any means. Sauron never doubted his own rightness, never questioned whether his grand designs were worth the suffering they caused. Yet the story also speaks of hope. It tells us that no evil, however ancient and powerful, is beyond defeat. That courage can be found in the most unlikely places and people. That even when darkness seems overwhelming, small lights held high can drive it back. That persistence and loyalty and simple goodness can prevail against malice and might. The world that Sauron sought to dominate continued without him, richer for his absence, healing from his influence. The tales of those who resisted him became the heritage of free peoples, reminders of what had been preserved and why it mattered. In the end, Sauron is gone, reduced to less than a shadow, unable to ever again take form or wield influence in the world. His works are dust. His armies are scattered. His name is remembered only as a warning and a wonder. How could one so mighty fall so far? And how was he defeated at last? The answer lies in the very nature of evil itself. It consumes what it touches, including, ultimately, the one who wields it. Sauron forged the ring, thinking to master all others, but he only succeeded in making himself vulnerable. He sought immortality and indestructibility, but he bound his existence to an object that could be destroyed. In his arrogance and pride, he crafted the very instrument of his downfall. And so the Dark Lord passed from the world, and Middle-earth knew peace. The Fourth Age began, an age of men, where the ancient powers of earlier times faded into memory and myth. The sun rose each morning and set each evening. The rivers flowed to the sea. The wind moved through the grass. All was as it should be, as it had been meant to be before Sauron sought to remake it in his image. The world was free to grow and change according to its own nature, not according to the will of any Dark Lord seeking dominion. In this, perhaps, lies the final defeat of Sauron. Not merely that he was destroyed, but that the world he sought to control continued without him as if he had never been. The natural order reasserted itself. Life, which is stronger than any evil, endured and flourished. And the peoples of Middle-earth, having faced the darkness and overcome it, could at last rest in peace. The tale is told. The story ends. The Dark Lord Sauron is no more, and the world sleeps soundly, freed from his shadow at last. Our tale ends here. Rest now, and let the shadows of Middle-earth lull you to sleep.